Naruto groaned when he realized that the first item in the scroll that Mizuki told him he needed to learn a jutsu from in order to graduate was a Bunshin technique, which meant that he'd never get it down, not in a million years. Sighing, he turned to the next item in the scroll, which seemed to be a complicated flowchart diagram of some sort that he couldn't make heads or tails of either way. Growling, he unfurled the scroll. Even further, yet another jutsu he couldn't make heads or tails of that was accompanied by a number of gruesome illustrations. He kept unfurling the scroll until he'd reached the next to last item on it. At first he couldn't make heads or tails of what he was looking at. Then, he realized that if he kind of squinted and looked at the picture sideways, he could sort of understand it. The smaller picture next to the list of hand seals seemed incomplete somehow, as if something were missing. The complicated scribbles someone had added to the margins didn't help all that much, though. As he was figuring out exactly what the technique appeared to be missing, Irika turned up looking none too happy to see him there, not noticing that the scroll had completely unfurled while he was reading, or even spotting what came after the jutsu he was looking at. Naruto looked up from the scroll he'd been studying as intently as he could in spite of his less than stellar reading skills. "Oh man, you found me already?" Naruto said, pouting since he wasn't sure he'd actually learned anything from the scroll. "I haven't gotten everything ready yet." "Ready for what?" Irika asked. "If you hand me some paper and some sealing ink, I'll show you," Naruto replied. "What do you need these for?" Irika asked as he handed over said items which he'd had on his person because he'd been studying how to make storage seals and had carried the supplies in his vest in order to use in his free time. He honestly didn't know what possessed him to hand them over, considering the seal he'd seen on display and the words surrounding it when he'd found his student. The seal that looked far older than it should have been and was written in the Shodai Hokage's handwriting. Perhaps it was because he'd wanted to bring Naruto in without a fight, and distracting the boy would be the best way to do so. Naruto had not shown any aptitude for the more academic areas of the ninja arts, so he'd most likely figured that the boy wouldn't get whatever he was planning right first try, and the worst that would happen would be some sealing ink would be wasted while he bound the distracted boy and turned him in. Perhaps it had been out of a morbid sense of curiosity over what would happen if Naruto actually managed to do something with the seal. Either way, Irika would find himself wondering about the reason he'd done something so stupid as handing Naruto sealing supplies for years to come. "Mizuki said that if I can learn one technique in this scroll, I can graduate," Naruto exclaimed as he opened the bottle of the sealing ink that Irika had handed him. "I figure that if I can find a squirrel or something, I can show you what I learned." "What did you learn?" Irika asked, somewhat fearfully looking at the scroll, which was still rolled entirely open, displaying a very familiar seal, and beginning to regret handing Naruto that sealing ink. "To know what it's called," Naruto said as he prepared the slip of paper. While Naruto's reading skills were nearly non-existent and his handwriting was barely legible, one area that he surprisingly wasn't lacking in was drawing. That, and he was quite capable of copying a picture and, in some cases, improving it if he had it in front of him to look at. Had the art been presented to him in the right way, Naruto would have been quite the forger. "There, now that control seal thingy is perfect," Naruto said as he finished drawing on the slip of paper that Irika had handed him with little to no idea of what he'd just created, only knowing that it looked right. Mizuki, who'd seen the scroll be unfurled to the point where the seal that had been used to place the qhps inside its vessel was revealed and had been warily waiting for Naruto to break the seal, decided it was safe enough to come out of hiding at that point, since the qhps had quite spectacularly failed to escape as he feared it would. While Irika was examining the seal that Naruto had made, unable to make heads or tails of it because it was so far beyond his level of understanding it wasn't even funny, Mizuki made his attack. After Mizuki had revealed to Naruto that he was the vessel for the qhps, in there was a chase and a fight, and Iruka saved Naruto's life and revealed that he viewed Naruto as a human being. There was a moment where Naruto and Mizuki stood facing off. In one world, Naruto would have pulled out about 1,000 Kage Bunshin and pounded Mizuki into the dirt. In this one, however, "What are you doing?" Mizuki asked as he watched the Uzumaki boy cycle through several hand signs as he said, "You know, I was going to bring my pet frog back first." But the last thing the arrogant Mizuki, who'd wanted to show Naruto the true meaning of despair when whatever jutsu the boy was attempting inevitably failed to defeat him, heard was Edo Tensei. Normally, considering the requirements for the jutsu in question, this would have had about as much effect as yelling Fairy Sparkle Princess Attack, but it had worked on that day thanks to the fact that Naruto hadn't been thinking of bringing anyone in. Particular back had the devil's own luck and a habit of fishing things he found to be potentially useful out of the trash or any other sort of junk pile he came across. The junk pile that Naruto had fished through on the way home from his failed academy graduation exam had been created by a woman who had been clearing out her deceased grandmother's home. The woman, who had no idea of the value of the things her grandmother had allowed to collect dust, had unwittingly tossed out several priceless treasures that would have had village historians and collectors alike salivating over the possibility of even looking at them in the process of clearing out the house in order to prepare it for sale. When Naruto had seen the lock of hair that was of a certain shade of raven-wing black, which shone with blue highlights under certain lighting sticking out of the middle of the trash pile, he had taken it with the intention of cutting it so he had several sections of the correct length and dividing it even further in order to sell it to Sasuke's fangirls. Having a living sacrifice for the Edo Tensei and a genetic sample that happened to have fallen out of his pocket in the rough vicinity of Mizuki at the right time and the devil's own luck on his side, Naruto managed to successfully complete the jutsu, despite the fact that by all rights it should not have worked. An instant after calling out the name of the jutsu, a coffin emerged from the ground where an arrogant Mizuki had been standing just an instant before. As a somewhat confused Naruto wondered what the hell the coffin was for, the lid to the upright coffin opened and slammed to the ground. "Ah crap, he's old," Naruto said while the elderly man who'd previously been in the coffin took a single step outside the coffin which fell to the ground behind him, grumbling about how his new jutsu completely sucked and how it had probably been Mizuki who'd ruined it. Naruto tied the corrected seal that he'd created to a kunai that he'd picked up and moved over to the old man who'd appeared in Mizuki's place. Following instructions he'd only half understood, Naruto sunk the kunai with his modified seal into the body of the elderly man who was leaning on a kama as if it were a cane. The old man sluggishly blinked as he looked down at Naruto. Then, the man looked like he was thinking about something and blinked again. "What the hell did you do to me, boy?" the old man rasped. I used the Edo Tensei thing and you popped out of the box," Naruto said, somewhat disappointed in the sucky result of the jutsu he'd picked and wondering who the hell the old man was. "Are you sure this is the Edo Tensei? I should have been able to break the contract seal." "If it were," the old man rasped, leaning more heavily on the kama and looking as if he wanted to kill the child in front of him as he asked, Contract seal? You mean that control thing, right?" "I fixed it," Naruto replied, looking somewhat proud of himself for having completed one of the jutsu from the scroll even if Mizuki had kinda ruined it. "After you release me, you'd better pray that I never find you again," the old man snarled. "Huh? Release? How do you do that?" Naruto asked. The old man growled at this, his eyes turning a blazing Sharingan red. Whatever the old man had planned on doing, it didn't work since he was forcibly frozen in place. When he'd gotten within 6 inches of Naruto, Naruto wasn't paying attention to any of this, however, since he was more focused on the injured Iruka who was staring at the old man with wide eyes. "Hey, Iruka-sensei?" Naruto asked, catching the rather shaken Chunin's attention. "Yes?" the rather ashen man asked. Even though I can't send him back, do I still pass? Naruto asked. Chapter 2. In his office, Sarutobi Hiruzen groaned as he buried his face in his hands. Trust Naruto. To find and use what was probably the most heinous jutsu in existence without even realizing what he had done wrong. There was a reason his sensei had abandoned research into the Edo Tensei and tried to bury the existence of the jutsu after all. Looking back into his crystal ball, he saw a rather nervous-looking Irika handing his Hitayate over to the Uzumaki boy, while the elderly man, who was clearly a Uchiha if his eyes were any indication, looked on sourly. Something like this could seriously strain the budding relationship between Naruto and Irika. Had the man thought the boy had known what he'd done, it likely would have destroyed it completely already. He would have to impress upon the child the severity of his actions and make him promise to never use that jutsu again. As they made their way to Ichiraku Ramen, Irika studied the boy to whom he'd just handed his Hitayate, despite the fact that the boy had spoken of using the technique he'd just used on Mizuki to return his pet from the dead. He didn't think Naruto entirely understood what he'd just done, thanks to the fact that Naruto had been rejected by society for his entire life. He'd had to learn social norms by looking in from the outside. Considering this, he shouldn't have been surprised to discover that Naruto's sense of right and wrong was completely skewed, since he hadn't had someone around to teach him right from wrong, and had therefore had to learn what few morals he'd had from television, books, and whatever went on in that strange little head of his. Apparently, what Naruto had watched and read during his childhood had never dealt with bringing the dead back, and why doing such things was morally questionable at the very least. It looked that this was yet another of the things he would have to teach the boy if he wanted him to be able to function in society. The old man that Naruto had summoned from the grave unsettled him greatly, and not only because his friend of many years who'd turned traitor had been used as the sacrifice that had returned him right before his very eyes. There was something disturbingly familiar about the ancient Uchiha who'd raised his hand and his weapon to attack the Uzumaki child, who'd summoned him any number of times only to discover that he was unable to do so. That, and the man's muttering about what he wanted to do to the village, sent shivers up and down his spine. Trying to paste on a smile for his student whom he was treating, he took a seat at the counter of Tuchi's stand, which was just opening for the day, in order to catch the early bird crowd and the late crowd that was on their way home. Naruto took a seat beside him, and the old man that Naruto brought back from the dead stood nearby, apparently as far away as he could get from the boy who'd summoned him, considering the fact that he didn't go any further. "Aren't you hungry?" Naruto asked around a mouthful of noodles as he was scarfing down on his first bowl. "No, I'm fine," he replied, not feeling all that hungry, what with the events from the night before and all those injuries he'd gotten in the fight with Mizuki, including that gash in his back that he'd mostly gotten healed using a jutsu he'd learned back during his Genin days. "Aren't you hungry?" Naruto asked the ancient man he'd summoned after he'd finished inhaling his ramen. "No," the old man who was leaning on his kama said. "And besides, I don't care for ramen." "Don't care for ramen?" Naruto exclaimed, sounding stunned. "Why not? Ramen's the food of the gods." "Inarizushi is the food of the gods," the old man snapped at Naruto. Grumbling about his obviously defective jutsu, Naruto turned back to Tuchi and ordered another bowl of ramen. "Who's that, Naruto?" Tuchi asked as he handed Naruto his second bowl of the day. "Dunno," Naruto replied as he dug into his noodles. "He's just some old man I summoned from the afterlife with a jutsu I found in the Forbidden Scroll." Both Tuchi and Ayam looked appropriately horrified by this revelation. "For your information, brat," the old man spat, "I happen to be Uchiha Madara." "Really? So you're like that Sasuke jerk's granddad or something. He'll be happy to see you." Naruto, who'd apparently slept through one too many history classes, said. "Why did you bring Madara back from the dead?" Tuchi asked, almost looking as if he'd close-up shop if Naruto asked for another bowl of ramen. He understood why. considering how immoral Naruto's actions would have been under normal circumstances, and how immoral they'd still been under the ones in which the man had been summoned. That, and summoning the first ninja to betray Konoha back from the dead was a rather stupid thing to do, especially considering what Madara had done at the Valley of the End and what Naruto was. I don't know. I wasn't really thinking at the time, other than that the jutsu I learned in the Forbidden Scroll thing was the strongest jutsu I knew, and that Mizuki would hurt Iruka Sensei if I didn't stop him. Naruto replied. I didn't think that I wouldn't have been able to send whoever came over back to where he came from once it was over. Why can't you send him back? I am asked, apparently excusing Naruto's crime against nature since he'd done it to save someone else if her expression was any indication. I don't know how, Naruto replied. I kinda know how I got him here, but I don't remember everything from that scroll thing, and Iruka Sensei wouldn't let me read it. Again, before the Yanbu guys came to pick it up, they tried to take the old dude with them as well, but he just turned up back where me and Iruka Sensei were a minute later. Oh dear, Tucci said. Oh dear was an understatement as far as Iruka was concerned. After the Yanbu had examined him and saw that he'd mostly taken care of his injuries, they'd handed him some bandages for what was left of the wound on his back and the numerous smaller injuries he had, and turned him and Naruto loose before they carried off the scroll and the old man who hadn't struggled since he'd apparently wanted to be away from Naruto and in the clutches of someone who might be able to send him back to the afterlife. Before they'd even reached the outskirts of the village, the old man was back. And not happy to be so if the manner in which he'd destroyed a sizable number of trees was any indication. Naruto was apparently stuck with the old man who was apparently the first shinobi to betray Konoha. Whether the boy deserved it or not remained to be seen, however. As Madara watched the blonde Uzumaki, who was dressed in threadbare white pajamas and a cap that looked like it was eating its head, crawl into bed an hour after they'd left Ichiraku Ramen, he longed to strangle the child. This was most definitely not how he'd wanted to be brought back from the dead. It was too soon for one. Oh, right. Do you want the bed? The Uzumaki boy said, crawling out of the bed he'd been climbing into. Why would I want your bed? He asked the whisker-cheeked child whose face was naggingly familiar for some reason, and not just because he possessed the standard Uzumaki features minus the signature red hair. To sleep on, the Uzumaki boy mumbled. Seeing as you're a guest and all. He paused and stared at the boy for a minute. Normally, if some brat had summoned him with the Edo Tensei, they would be demanding that he do their bidding. The Uzumaki boy, however, had offered him food and his own bed to sleep in. I don't sleep, he said, guessing that that was likely true, considering the fact that he didn't feel the least bit tired. He felt old and run down, but he didn't feel tired, nor did he feel the aches and pains that had come with old age. That could be considered a bonus at least. Chapter 3. The first clue that Toby had that he was in deep shit was a memo from the intelligence department informing Yagura, who was nearing the end of his years as Mizukage, that the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had learned the Edo Tensei and summoned some old man from the grave. The second clue came a couple days later when a letter from Nagato arrived, asking what the hell was going on. He'd nearly had a heart attack when he'd reached the name Uchiha Madara. This was most definitely not supposed to be happening. Seeing as Madara wasn't supposed to be back until everything was gathered, war was declared, so all of the strongest shinobi in the world could be gathered in one place and eliminated, and the Jabi was nearly ready. Toby knew he had two options at that point: denounce the Madara in Konoha as a fake and hope he understood, or do damage control like crazy. Either way, he'd be stuck, covering his ass and hoping and praying that he didn't get anything sharp and pointy stuck in it. While most of the Akatsuki were in it pretty much for the hell of it, or for the power they'd receive later when pain supposedly took control, Kisame was going to be pissed at the very least. Coming to a decision, he turned and left the Mizukage to run on autopilot as he did every time he left for an extended period of time, and headed out to do damage control since he knew which was the more dangerous of the two when it came to Madara and Kisame, and how Madara would likely react if he denounced him as a fake, even if it was to salvage their plan. The reason he'd headed out as quickly as he did, without even bothering to make basic preparations for his journey, was because he figured it would be best to get it out of the way as fast as possible, since the longer it took him to respond, the guiltier he would look. Hopefully, Kisame would be an understanding individual who'd forgive him his half-truths, seeing as Madara was making thr perfect world he'd told him about, and he was only the tool through which it was being done. Madara sighed as he followed Naruto to the academy. After he'd made the mistake of mentioning that he'd helped found Konoha, the boy wouldn't shut up about the place, apparently thinking that he'd be happy to know how the village he'd be happy to wipe off the face of the earth as if it had never existed had fared in the years since Hashirama had gone and stabbed him through the chest at the Valley of the End. Apparently, even to the end, Hashirama had viewed him as a friend on some level. When he'd stabbed him through the chest at the end of their final battle, the sword had just barely missed both his heart and lung. He'd passed out after having his final say with his old friend/enemy, who wouldn't after the battle they had, and the rather exhausted Hashirama, who hadn't even bothered to check his pulse, had left him behind after crying over his corpse, figuring that his family would deal with the burial arrangements. The final wound had damn near killed him back then, as had the infection he'd contracted after the battle, in which he'd been stabbed with several dirty weapons and lain in a puddle of stagnant water before that newly formed waterfall that had been a result of the titanic struggle between him and Hashirama had washed him down the newly formed branch of a nearby river, and he'd gotten fetched up on some rocks. He'd only been half awake and had looked like a drowned rat when his rescuers had pulled him out, dumped him on a pallet in one of their homes, and started tending to his injuries as an act of charity. And this is the academy. The Nidaime founded it, Tabeo, the Uzumaki, whose blood was not in question in his mind, since he'd known far too many of that clan's said, when they reached their destination, looking proud that he'd remembered that fact. "What idiot told you that?" he ended up saying after he'd come up short upon hearing that Senju effing Tobarama had been credited with the founding of Konoha's ninja academy. "Hashirama and I founded the academy. It was one of the first things we did after getting Konoha off the ground. The closest Tobarama came to founding the academy was shoveling the first scoop of dirt out of the plot that had been set aside for it, because his brother and I were stuck in a meeting with the local daimyo that we couldn't get out of." "Really? Wow," the Uzumaki said, apparently still slightly in awe over the fact that he was in the presence of one of the men who'd founded Konoha, having apparently not cracked open a history text that detailed what he'd done after he'd helped found the village. At the door to the academy, which was a rather sturdy building that was covered in numerous near-invisible seals for everything from fire protection to flood protection, which would probably take a Biju at the very least to destroy, the Uzumaki paused and started thinking for a moment. "You might want to wait out here," the Uzumaki said, somewhat nervously. "Why?" he asked, wondering what the point of his being dragged all the way out here was, if he was just going to be left to sit around outside. Well, I heard one of the instructors say that they wished they could meet the guy who'd thought up the academy, so he could drag him out back and beat the crap out of him. That, and every student has tried to blow up or burn down the academy at least once," the Uzumaki replied, muttering the last part so quietly that he almost didn't hear him. "All of them?" he asked, somewhat amused as he pictured Hashirama's reaction to the little kiddies trying to burn down the academy that he'd worked so hard to have built, thinking that it would solve the world's problems when it would only make things worse in the end. "That was me," the Uzumaki said, sounding slightly embarrassed as he pointed to a bit of fire damage that had been painted over. "Let's head inside before you end up late for your assignment," he said to the Uzumaki. in a tone that was neither approving or disapproving in order to change the subject. There was no way in hell he would be proud of the boy who'd undoubtedly complicated things greatly simply by existing, considering the fact that the QB was supposed to be running free right now, and Konoha should have been wiped off the map already. Trust Obito to screw everything up. Knowing him, he'd likely spared the village out of some sort of misplaced sentimentality. The boy was too much like his second eldest brother had spared that pregnant Senju who'd gone and stabbed him in the heart for his troubles. After passing through hallways that looked like they belonged to just about any or every school of a certain size that he'd encountered, he and the Uzumaki boy ended up in a rather standard-looking classroom with tiered seating which contained about 20 children who were roughly the same age as the Uzumaki. "What are you doing here? This meeting's only for people who graduated," a boy who'd gone to confront the Uzumaki said as the Uzumaki boy moved to pick his seat. "You see the headband?" the Uzumaki said. "That means I've graduated." Honor satisfied, the boy shrugged and went back to the conversation he was having with his friends. The Uzumaki then sat down at a desk near the middle of the room, next to a dark-haired boy in a high-collared shirt whom he was almost 99% certain was a Uchiha, since the kid looked like those sourpusses in the clan he used to like to needle back when he was a kid in order to deflate their oversized egos. Even after he'd gone and lost all of his siblings, he'd still found time to smile, unlike some drama queens in his clan that he could name. After sitting down, the Uzumaki boy frowned for a second, then slid to the middle of the desk and gestured for him to come over and sit down. Unable to not comply, he moved and sat his ancient body down in a seat that had been designed for a child and therefore didn't have the legroom he needed, ignoring the curious and apprehensive looks that the children in the room, who'd likely thought him to be a village official or something up until then, shot him upon actually noticing him the instant he started displaying behavior which was outside the norm for them. Sighing, he turned to face the aisle since he did not want to hang around for who knew how long, having his knees and his upper thighs crushed by the desk in front of him. As soon as he sat down and got himself as settled as he could be, the Uzumaki turned and tried to get the attention of the scowling Uchiha boy who'd been simultaneously glaring at the class and determinately ignoring it. The boy rather determinedly turned away from the Uzumaki, struggling to ignore him as well, while a pink-haired girl who'd been loudly pushing and shoving a Yamanaka girl in the doorway of the room looked nervously between him and the Uchiha boy, clearly wanting to be close to the Uchiha boy who was ignoring the Uzumaki, but too afraid to get close to him in order to do so. Seeing as he'd had that effect on children for ages, he dismissed it. The Uzumaki finally gave up on getting the Uchiha boy's attention after several attempts. "Damn bastard," the Uzumaki grumbled. "He thinks he's so special because he's the last of the Uchiha, and everyone gives him everything because of it." He's the last of the what? He was definitely going to be having words with Obito. Chapter 4. Madara sighed, wishing this farce would just be over soon. They had been left to wait by the Uzumaki boy's new sensei who had yet to arrive, the instructor who'd accompanied the Uzumaki boy on the farce that had resulted in his accidental resurrection had already packed up and left more than an hour ago, muttering something about how he'd strangle the Hitaki if it wouldn't provide him with yet another excuse for being even later for something else he himself would be making. His displeasure with the Jounin known when the man whose name he recognized from young Obito's constant ranting about why he had to get back home arrived. While he wasn't the most punctual of people, he hadn't appreciated his young relative Obito's habit of procrastination that would have had him be late for everything if they hadn't been trapped in the same damn cave with each other. This man was even slower to do things than Obito, whom he'd rechristened Toby, was. Speaking of Toby, he would be having words with that little brat the next time he saw him. Wiping out the Uchiha clan wasn't exactly part of the plan, though there were good odds that it would have eventually happened during the final stage. Due to that whole clan loyalty thing that had been drilled into him practically since birth. He'd been planning on giving the descendants of his former kin a final chance before he killed them off himself, seeing as every last one of those who'd cast him out had died. Often a fair few of their descendants might have accepted him as their leader, much as Toby eventually had. That last chance apparently wasn't to be, however, since his minion had gone and rather terminally sorted out his family issues permanently, taking the option off the table. Despite the fact that his clan had turned their backs on him long ago, choosing this broken village which had proven to be the death trap he'd foreseen, it would be over. True peace, he was surprised to find that learning of the death of his clan actually stung. So much so, in fact, that he'd barely noticed his surroundings until he had been the only one in the room. The Uzumaki boy having gotten up to some antics that had resulted in him being beaten up by the kunoichi of his graduating class, the boys' class. Divided into teams after the instructor had finally arrived and the students sent out to lunch. On the surface, this academy, which the brat who'd summoned him would eventually be departing from in the company of a jounin who would have been a smear on the wall. Were he younger and feeling more up to it, was everything he and Hashirama had dreamed of when they were children. Look beneath the surface, however, and you'd see that this place was fatally flawed and broken, just as the village as a whole was. Part of the reason the village was broken was because Tobarama had been quietly stirring resentment in the background, handing out favors such as choice bits of property on which to build homes to the allies of the Senju and alienating the Uchiha and their allies, as well as anyone else that Tobarama personally disliked for whatever reason. Another part was that Hashirama could only see the first cessation of fighting in his lifetime and refused to correct course or rein his beloved brother in until it was too late and the damage had been done. That, and the fact that with the new village system, it would now be the ninja themselves who would be seeking to expand their territory rather than the countries that had previously sponsored them and garnered resentment from the ninja who depended on them to survive because they were forced to fight in conflicts in which they personally had no stake. With something personal at stake, the resulting wars could only be and were that much worse. The longish periods of peace between each of the shinobi world wars were only rebuilding periods during which the villages got their numbers back up for yet another conflict in which all of the smaller countries that were trapped between the larger ones became collateral damage. He'd seen what was coming long ago, knew that things would be eventually coming to a head, but everyone had been too busy enjoying the calm before the storm to listen to him. Even his own clan, who'd very easily put the conflict aside and cast aside their resentment because back then it had only been business after all, very deadly. Business that had pitted families against each other for generations until all everyone living could remember was war, but business nonetheless. The Uzumaki who had nearly paid the ultimate price, leaving behind only a few scattered descendants like his summoner who was currently putting an eraser in the jam of the sliding door that led into the room, had been only one of dozens upon dozens of casualties of this flawed system, great works of sealing the likes of which the world had never seen before and would never see again were now lost to the ages. The Hitaki, who'd never been particularly numerous and were now whittled down to the silver-haired brat who had just come in that was strangely reminding him of Tobarama, and getting his dander up as a result were another casualty. As he followed the Uzumaki boy and his little teammates to the roof, he felt a faint spark of the old fire that made him want to go all out against the Hitaki brat. And that was all just a spark. The fire had been long since banked by age, and he just couldn't. Not to sound crude, but for a lack of a better term, he just couldn't get it up anymore. He wasn't particularly bloodthirsty off the battlefield, and despite the reputation he'd earned in his youth, he didn't kill when it wasn't necessary, but on the battlefield, the rush was incomparable. That knowledge that you were teetering on that knife's edge between life and death, and that feeling that you were invincible as you slaughtered score after score of the enemy, the even greater rush as you faced Someone who might actually be a threat, someone who had even the slightest chance of killing you. The greatest fun of all, going up against Hashirama, who was always just a hair better than he was no matter how many times he thought that he'd finally equaled or surpassed him. There was nothing like it, and it always went to his head. That fire was gone now, which was just as well considering the come down afterwards. While the battlefield high may be the best kind of high he'd ever had, the crash afterwards. And so you see, while I may have fudged one or two minor, stating that I was Uchiha Madara, who was using an immortality jutsu that involved possessing a descendant of mine, was a flat-out lie. But since we're all working for Madara to create a world without lies and all that, I didn't really, Obito said, attempting to placate one of the most valuable members of the Akatsuki. He'd gotten here as quickly as he could, Kimui being good for that sort of thing. It wasn't fast enough, however, as information had already gotten to Kisame via Itachi, who kept his finger on the pulse of current events in Konoha and was never more than 2 days behind when it came to knowing about important events despite his distance from the village. He was in hot water with Kisame, who'd known of his treachery for several days now. But in a toss-up between being in deep shit with Kisame and being in it with Madara as he would be should he denounce him as a fraud in order to salvage things, he'd choose Kisame any day of the week. Though, he really didn't want to be in it with either of them, despite the fact that it was inevitable that he'd be in trouble either way. Despite being dangerous and potentially very troublesome, Kisame wasn't a physical threat to him thanks to Kimui, but if the shark-like swordsman ever decided to turn against the Akatsuki, only Itachi and Pain would really be able to stand against him, which would be trouble for his and Madara's plans. The damage Kisame alone could cause is near incalculable and could undo years of work in the span of hours. While all of the Akatsuki's 9 members were S-ranked missing Nin, not all S-ranked ninja were equal, as Kakuzu's constantly killing his partners illustrates, and Kisame was a top-tier member of the group. Not the best, but he could take out several members before he was finally taken down if he chose to go against them. Sure, he would be able to take Kisame down if he so chose, but there'd be Itachi to deal with afterwards, and if he had a single exploitable weakness as a result of his fight with Kisame, he knew full well that Itachi viewed him as a threat to both his brother and Konoha, despite the promises he'd made to the effect of leaving both alone so long as Itachi was alive, and that the younger Uchiha wouldn't hesitate to take him out if he thought he might have a chance of being able to do so. Part of what had restrained Itachi previously was the belief that he was Uchiha Madara and therefore immortal. That particular advantage was gone now, however, and the first sign of any weakness whatsoever would have Itachi on him like white on rice. "Who are you?" Itachi, who'd been silently studying him intently throughout his entire explanation to Kisame, who'd fortunately restrained himself long enough to hear, asked. "No one," he replied, hoping that he didn't sound defensive. Normally he wouldn't. But seeing as Madara's back to retake his name, "You can call me Toby," he eventually said after Itachi gave him that look that his mother could do, which never failed to make him feel guilty and confess to sins real or imagined in order to get her to stop. "Toby, too, Tonai, Bito and I," Itachi, who apparently had a long memory and was quick on the uptake, said, as Kisame, who'd only just barely held his temper in check long enough to hear an explanation, reached for his sword, clearly ready to make good on his, "If you're lying to me, I'll kill you, promise." Itachi's eye gave that twitch his fathers used to when he'd said or did something that made his brain break. Usually such an occurrence happened at least twice a week with his father, but this was completely new and somewhat out of character for the normally stoic Itachi, who hadn't so much as twitched when a spider the size of his hand had crawled across his face last year. Considering the extreme reaction, he found himself wondering what it was that his young cousin had tried and failed to compute. "Bito and I, what did Madara do to you?" Itachi loudly exclaimed, causing Kisame to drop his sword and stare at his normally silent partner who hadn't made a goddamned sound when his hand had been skewered by a sunbon that one time in shock. Chapter 5. Author's note to the guest reviewer Narusaku. Are you even aware that you posted some chapters of one of your stories in my reviews? I mean, seriously, I go? Looking at the review notices in my email and went, what the fuck? Now on with the story. Hibachi and Ami, who had known each other since before the academy, since their mothers used to drop them off at the same daycare, sat together on a rooftop watching the people pass below as they tried to keep their minds off of what would be coming for them in the morning, while their parents had been proud of their academy graduation, going as far as to give them presents. They had grown quieter and quieter. In the week between graduation and team assignment, it had almost been as if they knew about the surprise test. Ami wasn't Hibachi's usual crew, but since they would be teammates soon, he figured he may as well hang out with her despite the fact that she was a girly girl. If Ami hadn't been a kunoichi from a small shinobi family, odds were that she would have been having tea parties with teddy bears or whatever the heck it was that civilian girls did. The fact that she constantly fawned over that bastard Uchiha was bad enough in his book. Fortunately, he knew her and could stand her in small doses, so that was a plus. What's with that? Ami exclaimed, pulling him out of his musings on tomorrow's exam. The girl was pointing to the old man who was trailing after the dead last. He had absolutely no idea who the old man was, or even why he'd be following Naruto of all people. When he'd first caught sight of him back at the academy, he'd thought that the man was one of the village elders who was doing a tour of the academy for whatever reason, probably because of the expensive new windows that had drawn complaints from his own grandfather, mainly as the windows had to be put in because Naruto had happened to the old ones. That theory had been blown out of the water, however. When the old man had sat down next to Naruto, there had been some chatter amongst the adults over the past week that had something to do with Naruto and an old man. But like most kids, he hadn't really paid any attention, having gotten used to tuning his parents out when they started talking about the Uzumaki. If he didn't know for a fact that Naruto was a clanless orphan as his parents had constantly repeated this fact, he would swear that the old man was his great-grandfather or something. That couldn't be the case, however, and who the old man was a complete mystery to him, a mystery that he probably would have had solved earlier that day had the bastard Uchiha paid attention to Naruto's attempts to call his attention to the old man sitting next to him. Unfortunately, Sasuke had refused to so much as look in the old man's direction. As he and Ami watched, an old man who had been passing the Uzumaki with the usual scowl rapidly paled upon spotting the old man who was trailing behind the boy. Looked like he was about to have a heart attack and started frantically making gestures meant to ward off evil. The old man who was following Naruto stopped upon spotting the man and gave him an evil smile that creeped him out despite the fact that he was all the way up here and presumably out of sight of anyone who wasn't actually looking for him. Good evening, Imidara-sama, the younger-looking old man who was trembling in his sandals stammered. Ah, Kenichi-kun. It's so good to see you again, the wrinkled old geezer who now looked downright evil said. You won't be attempting to throw any rocks through my window in the near future, I trust. And no, Imidara-sama, I. The old man, whose name was apparently Kenichi, stammered before becoming completely inaudible. That's good to hear, the older old man said. Perhaps I could have Naruto help you bring your groceries home. They do look rather heavy. And no, that isn't, Kenichi said before his courage apparently failed him and turned tail and fled. Hibachi wasn't entirely sure about his lip-reading skills, but he thought he'd seen the old man say, I've still got it, as Kenichi disappeared around the corner. He turned to look at Ami, who'd turned to look at him. The hell was that all about? Ami asked, summing up what they both were thinking. The Hokage sighed as he repressed the urge to bury his face in his hands. This had been the third time this week that his men had been forced to roust the fringe and some of the not-so-fringe elements out of the emergency shelters which were starting to look like a shantytown. Fortunately, nobody had gone so far as to attack either Naruto or Madara. He knew that it would be an unmitigated disaster if someone were stupid enough to do so, considering the fact that Madara was the original god of shinobi and now unkillable to boot. Word of Madara's revival had passed through the shinobi ranks like wildfire, but fortunately he'd caught things in time before the civilians could be led into the loop and panic, as about 150 shinobi who were convinced that it was the apocalypse had done, rather than screeching out 100 different theories about how he was responsible for Madara's appearance or how the founding of the village itself was a conspiracy. The fringe jobs had all decided to agree on the fact that the end is nigh, and decided to be elsewhere to ride out the coming storm. Those who didn't have their own private bunkers had flooded the emergency shelters and set up a small, thriving, and somewhat insane civilization that had repeatedly had to be cleared out, as Madara's presence in Konoha had quite fortunately not yet rated an actual emergency due to whatever the hell Naruto had done with the Edo Tensei. For the first time, he didn't feel guilty that he'd had Naruto subtly discouraged from studying seals. He'd had Naruto recreate what he'd done to the Edo Tensei contract seal to the best of his abilities before he'd made the boy promise to never use the technique again unless it were a truly dire situation and there were no other options. And the R&D team he'd handed it to had yet to make heads or tails of it. All they could say was that it was either insanely brilliant or brilliantly insane. And Danzo was of no help whatsoever, as he's locked himself in his office and refused to come out. The ENBU who was giving him the report on the latest eviction sweep of the emergency shelters said Danzo had been locked in his office for the entire week, and he knew why. And to think, he'd almost entirely forgotten about his rival's near-crippling materaphobia. Back when they were young, materaphobia had been an actual illness, and there had been a support group with weekly meetings. The villagers that scoff now would probably soon learn why should any of them be stupid enough to make the man whom even he stepped carefully around truly angry. As he sat on the roof directly across from Naruto's window, Kakashi discreetly nodded to Tenzo, who looked completely exhausted. The poor man probably hadn't had a wink of sleep this entire week. Tenzo had pretty much drawn permanent Naruto watching duty by virtue of his abilities thanks to Madara's arrival, and he'd taken his responsibilities very seriously, neglecting his own health and well-being in the process. There were two others on a shift that usually rated only one ENBU, making an hourly pass while on patrol, but Tenzo had apparently been unable to relax and allow himself to be relieved for fear of what would happen were he not there should Madara finally manage to make a move, as it was only a matter of time before the Uchiha managed to find a way around whatever the hell Naruto had done to him. There was some whining coming from inside Naruto's apartment as the boy's evening routine had once again been disrupted by Madara, whom the boy was strangely willing to take orders from, which was worrisome in and of itself. Usually around now, the Uzumaki would have finished tending to his plants and would have been doing light aerobics as he watched his favorite anime. Madara had yet again turned off the TV, however, and stuck a book under the boy's nose. Hence the whining. Deciding that tonight would be going the same as the last 5 nights had, and satisfied that Naruto was as safe as he could be in this situation, he turned and left. He hadn't slept all that much this week either, and he'd need his rest for tomorrow. You can't kill him, Itachi firmly stated as a massive sword sliced through where the lying snake Toby was standing and once again failed to do anything. And why not? Kisame asked, not bothering to mention the obvious reason for why. Not which had caused Toby to blow a raspberry in his mask at one point and then complain about how he'd gotten spit in his mask. I'm going to fix him so he'll be the way he used to be before Madara broke him, Itachi replied. Vito and I was the best cousin ever. He used to give me ice cream for breakfast and take me out for white chocolate mochas with extra caramel on top. Man, That's seriously evil, Kisame said, smirking at the audacity of loading a kid up on sugar and caffeine and dumping him on a pair of shinobi who could kill him 100 different ways for doing so, and wondering why Itachi's parents had been stupid enough to allow that Obito guy who he'd seriously be killing the second he was sure he could get away with it to babysit his partner more than once. Toby, or whatever the hell his name was a lying bastard, but he sure had balls. Chapter 6. Naruto turned pale as he was brushing his teeth and realized he'd forgotten Madara's present, which could be very, very bad considering he hoped old man Madara liked the surprise he'd got for him. It was the best he could do on short notice considering how tough it was to get one of these things, which apparently had to be raised from when they were babies, since they could fight back and they were mean when they did so, especially when you pulled one of their young out of its nest. He'd been pecked by the parents more times than he could count, and the baby that he'd acquired had scratched and pecked him as well. He'd damn near been driven over the side of the roof, and he had bloody divots and scratches on his head, face, and hands. It was the least he could do for Madara, however, since he'd gone and summoned the old man from the afterlife, where he'd probably been happy with his family, and he didn't look too happy to be here. Looking into the box he'd carefully hidden in his training room, which Madara refused to enter since it was a disaster area, he was relieved to see movement. Since it was alive, everything should be fine. Madara liked birds, so this should make him very happy. "Hey, old man," he exclaimed as he came out of the training room. "Yes?" Madara asked, looking at him as if he were seeing someone else entirely like he usually did, someone else he didn't exactly like but put up with because he had to. "Seeing as you like birds and all, I got you this," he said as he thrust the box under the old man's nose. Madara looked down at the box the Uzumaki boy had given him several days earlier. The boy had asked him what he'd like to do with his free time when he wasn't fighting or polishing his kama, which he mostly used as a makeshift cane now, and he'd extolled the virtues of falconry. Caring for and training birds of prey was both difficult and rewarding. Apparently, the boy who'd apologized for summoning him several times had taken his lecture to heart and was making an attempt at compensation. The box was rather small, which left him wondering what sort of bird he'd be raising. Anticipation rising, he opened the lid as his curiosity got the better of him and peered inside. It was small, it was feathery. One of its little beady eyes stared up at him with an indolent bovine curiosity rather than a laser-like intensity. Its little stringy legs were too long for its body, and it was dinner for the birds he usually kept. "And what am I supposed to hunt with this? Worms?" he asked as he held up the small sparrow chick that the Uzumaki child who'd apparently not paid any attention to his lecture on falconry had presented to him, having apparently thought that he'd wanted a pet bird. "But I thought you said you liked sparrows," the Uzumaki boy mumbled, looking distinctly unhappy that his present hadn't gone over as well as he'd thought it would. "Sparrowhawks, I like sparrowhawks, you idiot," he said, not paying one whit of attention to the annoyed cheeping that came from the bird he'd still been holding as he waved his hands for emphasis. The Uzumaki looked like he was about to cry for about half a second before he scowled cutely, turned his back on him, and stormed over to his bed, which he flopped down on, his back facing him. Based on his posture, the boy would remain that way for the rest of the night, sulking at the so-called insult he'd given him. If anything was an insult, it was that damn bird that was cheeping hungrily, having become somewhat resigned to the rough handling it was receiving lately. Sighing, he grabbed the most recently caught fly out of the spider web in the corner and started feeding it to the small creature that the almost completely oblivious Uzumaki had given him one leg at a time. He was almost tempted to feed the creature the wildflower seeds that the boy had set aside for planting tomorrow. Almost. As he set the bird back in its little box with a bottle cap full of water in case it got thirsty, he found he couldn't help but smile slightly. This was something that Hashirama would have pulled, were he almost completely brain dead. That was Tenzo stabbed himself in the hand with a sunban when he realized he was nodding off. Had a civilian tried to stay awake for about a week like he had, there would have been serious repercussions, including possible personality changes for the worse amongst other things. As it was, he was really pushing it and had gotten to that point where he was too tired to sleep and only able to focus on one thing, Naruto. He could see the boy through the window of the small apartment that was obviously the home of a pair of bachelors, what with the pile of dirty dishes in the sink and the clean and dirty laundry piles. And while he was afraid of what Madara would do to the boy given half a chance, all he'd really seen the man do was give the boy a few light smacks on the head as he showed the boy how to properly cook something that wasn't ramen and tried to teach the boy who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes if his life depended on it how to read properly, stating each time that he refused to be forced to live with a total fucking idiot, and that at the very least the brat was going to be able to properly be able to feed itself and properly read and write. Naruto was currently sulking because the present he'd pulled from the rain gutter that morning hadn't gone over as well as he thought it would, but then again Madara was a Uchiha, and with the exception of a few individuals, the Uchiha were ungrateful bastards who would spit on what you gave them. He personally thought the sparrow was a very thoughtful gift, especially since the Uzumaki boy had risked his life to get it, almost falling off the building at one point, being forced to hold onto the rain gutter with one hand, as the sparrow's parents had harassed him. If he'd been given, Turtle sighed as he pulled the sedative-laced sunban out of Tenzo's backside. Had his colleague been more on his game, he wouldn't have been caught so completely off guard like this. He needed it, however, since he completely refused to get the rest he should be getting so he could be able to defend Konoha should Madara finally become a viable threat. Picking the other shinobi up, he slung him over the shoulder and carried him off to the hospital as his and Tenzo's previously arranged relief arrived. Itachi sat staring into the fire. Kisame had asked him why he wanted to save Bito and Ai. Despite everything he'd done, and he'd been forced to face his reasons. Part of it was because aside from Sasuke, he was the only living family he had left. Part of it was because he remembered what Bito and Ai had been like before he'd been expertly broken by Madara, who'd been skilled at such things. Part of it was because of Shursui, who due to the late age at which his father Kagami had had him, was younger than his nephew. Shursui had loved Bito, and he owed it to his favorite cousin to at least try to save him. Bito and Ai had been the one who gave him sweets, but he'd also been the one who had been unafraid to take the clan head's son to the park to play on the swings or roll in the dirt with one of the Inuzuka children rather than try to teach him how to properly throw Senbon or try to teach him kata. Bito and Ai had tried to let him be a kid, which was more than could be said of even his own parents. Each time he was caught and scolded for his Uchiha-like actions and his attempts at corrupting him, the teen was repentant for all of 5 minutes and unafraid to take him somewhere inappropriate, again as soon as his parents' backs were turned. The bloodthirsty monster who'd slaughtered the clan by his side was not Bito and Ai. It was quite possible that Madara had completely destroyed Bito and Ai and that he'd never get him back, but he had to try, if only to prove to himself that there might be hope for his own future redemption. His hands weren't completely unstained with the blood of the innocent after all, and if Bito and Ai was a monster, what would that make him? Chapter 7. Naruto grumbled as the covers were dragged off of him, and he was dragged out of bed. A good half hour before the alarm he'd set was due to go off. Seeing Madara's face first thing in the morning wasn't enjoyable. In fact, it was nearly heart-stoppingly frightening if you weren't expecting it. "What the hell did you do that for? It's not time to get up yet," he snarled, glaring at the gray pre-dawn sky that could be seen through the window he'd set his bed by so the morning sun could wake him back before he'd gotten the alarm clock. "Seeing as this test you're going to undertake is important for your future in this village, you should prepare for it," Madara said. "Though this whole village and the rest of this world is broken and needs to be replaced, The never-ending cycle of violence won't stop until it is. What's all that about? He asked. It's a long story that starts a very long time ago, Madara said. The ninja world was a mistake that should not have happened. Ninja never end the fighting, they just create more. What do you mean? He asked. Long ago, the Shinju created the world and stood sentinel over it, indifferent to all on it who worshipped it as a god. Every 1,000 years, the Shinju would bear a fruit. Once, during a period of endless warfare, the princess Otsutsuki Kagaya stole the forbidden fruit from the tree and ate it. Eating the fruit gave the princess godlike powers which she used to end the wars. The tree grew angry at this and took on a monstrous form in order to claim the power that was stolen from it, a form that would one day be known as the Jubi. One day, the princess gave birth to a son named Otsutsuki Hagoromo, who was born with the ability to use chakra. This boy would grow up and defeat the Jubi and seal it within itself. Madara started. As Hagoromo, who was worshipped as a god for his feat, grew older, he wandered the lands and shared the secrets of the ninja arts with the people, becoming known as the Sage of the Six Paths. As he was nearing his death, he realized that the Jubi would be free to rampage across the lands, so he sealed its body inside the moon and divided its chakra into 9 parts, which became the 9 Biju. Following this, the sage lay on his deathbed, where he called his 2 sons to him and asked his sons what the true key to peace was. The elder, who inherited his eyes, answered power. The younger, who had inherited his physical prowess, answered love. The sage left his legacy to the younger son, which made the elder intensely jealous and sparked fights between the brothers, who were the ancestors of the Senju and the Uchiha, continuing the cycle of endless war rather than bringing peace to the world. Madara continued his tale. There had been a time when I had thought that Hashirama and I had found the key to peace, but after a while I realized the new system was just as broken as the old one, and that the world needed to be remade for there to be true peace. Hashirama refused to listen, however, believing that the village we had created was the fulfillment for our dream, and refusing to see that it had been broken from the start. Tobirama adding to the conflict in the background and sliding the Uchiha every step of the way didn't help. Madara finished. What was that about the tree? He asked, not knowing how some giant tree had led to Konoha being broken and not understanding where those Biju things came into it. The old man looked like he wanted to strangle him. Then again, lots of people looked like they wanted to strangle him after he asked a question. Even Mizuki, while he was pretending to be nice in order to set him up. Just get out of my sight, the old man said, shaking his head. I swear he's worse than Toby. Grumbling, he grabbed his clothes for the day and headed into his training room in order to get dressed and grab a few things he might need for the survival exercise that Madara had called a test that he would be undertaking soon. Not having breakfast wasn't going to be much of a challenge, seeing as he needed to do some grocery shopping later. His milk was off, so were his eggs, and he was out of cereal, meaning all he had was instant ramen. A cheeping sound coming from the main room indicated that Madara's bird was awake. Here you go, you little worm sucker, Madara grumbled from the other side of the training room door. Danzo cautiously peered out the door of his office, then, upon seeing the empty hallway, he cautiously made his way down it. Upon noticing that the next hallway was mercifully clear of the Uchiha, who'd probably want revenge for that item he'd left on his doorstep shortly before his last duel with the Shodai Hokage, he made his way down that. Checking both ways down the T intersection, he made his way down the next hall, glad that there was no sign of Madara so far. Hopefully, he would be able to make his way to the main meeting hall in order to issue orders without running into the man who'd been brought back from the dead by the Jinchuriki. Matterophobia may seem ridiculous this day and age, especially considering how old the revived Madara was, but there are some fears that people don't let go of throughout their lives, and this one wasn't entirely a baseless one. Fear of Madara was Quite sensible, much as fear of the Yondaime had been in IWA following the Third War. He'd met one or two imposters who'd claimed they were Madara over the years, but they'd lacked the certain something that Madara possessed. He wasn't a natural chakra sensor, but there are some people who make such an impression on you that you never forget them no matter how hard you try. Back when he was a little kid, he'd made the rather dumb mistake of throwing a rock at Madara. Half a second later, the man had grabbed him by the throat and one-handedly slammed him into a nearby building before calmly lecturing him on exactly why doing something like that was a terminally stupid idea. The man had then sneered in disgust at him when he noticed he'd wet himself before dropping him into the puddle of his own urine. He'd been deathly afraid of Madara ever since. That hadn't stopped him from anonymously leaving a flaming bag of dog feces on the man's doorstep, though. A flaming bag of crap that Madara was sure to get his revenge on him for. There's no way that he has control over Madara no matter what you heard. I saw him running errands for him yesterday evening. One of the elderly, early morning shoppers whispered to another, completely ignoring Sasuke for the first time in years. Instead of giving him looks of pity as he passed, Naruto and the old man he'd turned up to the team assignments with currently absorbed everyone's attention despite the fact that they weren't in the vicinity. People were claiming that the ancient man was Uchiha Madara himself returned from the dead, but that was impossible, since Madara had died way back when he was in his prime. The Uzumaki had tried to get his attention and tried to get him to talk to the old man he'd brought with him the day before, but he'd resolutely ignored both. He'd had his mind on other things yesterday, more important things than some creepy old man who looked like that great uncle he'd been told to stay away from and never ever accept candy from. He was one step closer to growing strong enough to defeat Itachi. He'd just have to pass today's survival exercise in order to go farther. The Uzumaki better not hold him back. Sakura sighed as she tried to make her way out the door without her mother noticing her. The woman was an early riser and could be rather determined when she got something into her head. Currently, her mother was under the impression that her diet wasn't healthy, and she'd been trying to shove food down her throat lately. Getting out the door without breakfast, as her new sensei had suggested, was going to be a challenge, especially since she could smell eggs being fried already. Sakura, her mother called out to her when she saw her bypassing the dining area and sneaking out the door. No time to stop, Mom. I'm going to be late, she called back, hoping to make her way out of the door without any of the eggs her mother was fixing on the stove. All right, her mother said with a sigh, but you watch out for that Uzumaki boy and that old man he's got with him. They're dangerous. Shaking her head at the warning, she slipped her sandals on and headed out the door. She had no idea why her mother seemed to think that that Naruto clown was dangerous. The only thing she'd be in danger of around him would be being asked out. Again, that incredibly ancient-looking old man that Naruto had brought with him yesterday didn't look all that dangerous either. Creepy, yes. Dangerous, no. Making her way down the road, she concentrated on other things, more important. Things such as what Sasuke would want for lunch. Maybe now that they were teammates, they could have lunch together. Either way, being on Sasuke's team meant that she was ahead of the Ino pig in the running when it came to Sasuke's affections. Chapter 8. Madara sighed for the 5th time in the span of an hour as he sat on a suspiciously conveniently located log waiting for the Uzumaki boys, seemingly perpetually tardy sensei to arrive. Like Toby, that man would be late for his own funeral if it were at all possible. In fact, in the short time he'd spent in the silver-haired man's presence, the Jounin, who bore a rather unfortunate resemblance to Senju Tobarama, had displayed a number of Toby's less tolerable traits. He couldn't wait for this test to be over and done with. As soon as Naruto got over his excitement at being an actual shinobi of the leaf, he was going to do his level best to convince the boy to be something else. The last Uchiha, who'd completely ignored all of the Uzumaki brat's attempts at introducing him, had been giving him sideways glances since he'd arrived, but had made no other moves. The pink-haired fangirl was giving him looks of horror and disgust every time she glanced in his direction, apparently unable to believe that anyone could grow as old as he had before he'd passed, placing his will into Zetsu in case Toby decided to slack off and return to his former village as he'd been saying he'd wanted to do for months on end before that little girlfriend of his had died. Aside from the odd glances and complaints about how late their sensei was, the wait had been mostly conducted in silence by the newly minted team. On the part of the Uchiha and the Haruno that was, Naruto was sitting on the ground twitching, grumbling, and giving the occasional sleepy yawn. It was blatantly obvious that the boy was bored and running out of patience. Aside from the lack of occasional depressive bouts that were fueled by a lack of self-confidence, the person that Naruto reminded him most of was a young Hashirama, and he knew full well how to deal with. Hashirama set a challenge in front of that idiot Senju, and he'd move heaven and earth in order to complete it, even if it was entirely impossible. Naruto, why don't you set up an ambush in order to impress your new sensei when he arrives? He said, tired of watching the boy twitch hyperactively. How do I do that? The Uzumaki boy asked stupidly, causing the Uchiha boy to scoff, and the Haruno girl to stare at the boy in incredulity. Gritting his teeth, he tried to think of a way to explain in simple terms the boy would understand and relate to. He'd learned the hard way that that was the only way to get through to the boy a while back when he'd been dealing with a similar situation with Obito, who had been almost as dim as the Uzumaki. It's like setting up a prank, he said, having heard about the boy's previous antics as he passed through the village. He was nowhere near as oblivious as the boy, and the whispers that surrounded them weren't nearly as guarded as those conversing thought they were. But pranks are childish, and I swore I wouldn't pull any now that I'm a ninja, the Uzumaki exclaimed, apparently having forgotten the eraser from the day before. I said it's like setting up a prank, not actually setting up a prank, he snapped once, again losing patience with the boy and dearly wishing he could strangle the brat. Instead of putting up string and paint bombs or whatever it is you do when you're pranking some idiot who clearly deserves it for actually having fallen for it, you put up ninja wire and explosive tags and set traps in order to lead your target into a predetermined attack point. Oh, the Uzumaki said before blinking in that manner that indicated that his brain had somehow connected points A and Z without visiting any stops in between and come up with something that was either insanely brilliant or brilliantly insane, as Uzumaki were wont to do. With that, the Uzumaki was pulling supplies out of the concealed and expanded pockets in his coat, which had obviously been a gift from a master of the sealing arts. Seeing as he highly doubted that the Uzumaki had done it himself, considering the fact that the boy could barely read or write, after several minutes of work on the assigned training ground and a nearby copse of trees that had set the Uchiha to rolling his eyes, and the Haruno girl to whining about how they were going to get into trouble because he shouldn't be doing that. Naruto returned looking slightly embarrassed. I don't have any explosive tags, the Uzumaki said slightly sheepishly, apparently having started on whatever plan was in his head without stopping to consider that particular hitch in the proceedings. Sighing, because this was something every Uzumaki, or any other ninja for that matter, should know how to do, he pulled out the sealing supplies he'd managed to surreptitiously acquire while Naruto had been purchasing supplies earlier in the week, and quickly knocked out a basic explosive tag with a 10-second timer. Here's how you make an explosive tag, he said as he handed the slip of paper to the brat, who examined it intently, his eyes seemingly lighting up with understanding. The boy picked up another slip of paper, poured far too much chakra into the ink to be safe, and started drawing. What the boy was drawing bore only a slight resemblance to an explosive tag. What are you doing? He asked as the boy wasted ink. Drawing the picture in my head, the Uzumaki brat replied as he added some finishing strokes to his drawing, which set off a number of alarm bells in his mind. He grabbed the explosive tag out of Naruto's hands and examined it. Everything he knew about sealing and explosive tags in particular was telling him to be afraid, very afraid. Had they been alive, the Uzumaki clan would have kept that kid away from the sealing supplies long ago, if only for the preservation of their clan, if not for the preservation of the species as a whole. That's very. I think you only need one of those, and you should set it outside the village gates just to be safe. I'll be making any other explosive tags you might need in the future, he said as he moved to the furthest point he could be from the boy. While he wouldn't mind seeing Konoha blown off the map most of the time, he'd rather not be in the epicenter of an explosion that he hadn't caused and prepared for, and he wanted at least some of the villagers around to see what the world became. After his Moon's Eye plan was complete, he wouldn't be forgetting that design anytime soon. As the Hokage sat in his office, he had his scrying crystal tuned to a certain training ground so he could see how Kakashi dealt with the team that could be more adequately labeled guilt, and even more guilt, which he'd given the man partially in retaliation for failing every single team he'd been given, including a couple of promising ones. Since Kakashi was being his usual tardy self dialed up to 11, he was currently only giving the crystal the occasional glance as he dealt with the massive pile of paperwork that had collected on his desk while he was asleep. Because he was doing so, he was naturally surprised when he looked back to see Naruto and his charge gone. Half afraid that Naruto had lost patience and had decided to skip the final Genin test altogether, he set the crystal to the boy's location, ending him at the village gates explaining something to the usual guards while Madara, who was 10 feet away, made a number of frantic hand gestures behind him. His pre-founding Uchiha was a bit rusty, but he could have sworn that the man was signing big boom. Kotetsu finally caught on and let the pair pass, looking as if he knew he was going to regret it as he did so. The minute the barrier seal had been dropped and they'd been allowed to pass, Madara picked the Uzumaki boy up and shunshined the hell out of there. Izumo nervously watched the spot where the Uzumaki and his elderly companion had once been while Kotetsu turned and ran, presumably in the direction of the tower. Moments later, an out-of-breath Kotetsu arrived, confirming his suspicions. Out in the woods surrounding Konoha, one of Iwa's spies who usually visited the village 3 times a year disguised as a merchant trader was mapping out a possible invasion route when a familiar duo appeared. But why here? It's the middle of nowhere. The Uzumaki boy who he occasionally kept tabs on due to his slight resemblance to the late Yondaime whined as the elderly man who was presumably Madara instructed the boy to set an explosive tag that the boy had presumably made halfway up the trunk of a rather large tree. Because there's nothing important that might get turned into a fucking crater for miles. The elderly man, who did indeed bear a marked resemblance to Uchiha Madara, replied, "The last thing I need right now is a war I didn't start." After the tag was set, Madara picked up the Uzumaki boy and shunshined him out of the forest. Against his better judgment, his curiosity got the better of him, preparing for the worst, since all it would take would be for him to be unlucky once. He pulled out a bit of paper and uncaged the bird he'd brought with him in case he actually found an exploitable weakness in Konoha's defenses. I am going to examine explosive tag set by the presumed Madara and the Uzumaki boy I've previously reported on, he wrote. A cursory examination has revealed it to be a new type that was presumably devised by the Uzumaki. The basis of this assumption is an overheard conversation between the presumed Uchiha Madara and Uzumaki Naruto. After jotting down the conversation he'd overheard word for word, he sealed the missive, attached it to the bird, and sent it on its way to Iwa. That task done, he turned to make a more in-depth analysis of the apparently more powerful than usual explosive tag, prepared to run for it at any moment if it appeared that the odd-looking tag would be going off. As the aged Sandaime Hokage watched rocks and trees rain down upon the previously sleepy village of Konoha, which was now scurrying for any available shelter, he said. I've come up with a new law. What is it? Danzo asked from behind him, where he was nervously watching out for Madara in all of this mess, and too stressed to temper his words and try talking in circles around his rival. More bleeding heart garbage that'll further neuter our ninja forces. From now on, the Hokage said as the secretary who had been discreetly standing by opened his pad to take down his edict. Uzumaki Naruto is not to be allowed near any sealing supplies, and anyone who is caught attempting to teach him the sealing arts will be put to death immediately. That's actually a good law, Danzo said as he watched debris from a massive explosion rain down on the village. Orochimaru prepared the copy of the improvement that the Uzumaki boy had made to the Edo Tensei for his experiment. According to the intel he'd gathered, this improved contract seal would allow one who is summoned to act near autonomously while completely preventing them from turning against or even inadvertently harming their summoner, and kept outsiders from removing the summoned from the field and containing them elsewhere while taking a minimal amount of chakra from the summoner. The seal looked like something Jiraiya had once drawn while he was high on painkillers, and from what little of it he could decipher and what he'd heard about it, there appeared to be no drawbacks, since he was sure that there had to be a hitch. Somewhere, he was running this experiment, using the weaker of the two Hokages he planned on using to destroy Konoha in order to get things moving in a few short months. All too soon, the Night Aim was summoned and the new contract seal was put in place, rather than the standard one. A moment later, the late Hokage disappeared from the room as he was dragged somewhere, backwards and at a high rate of speed, smashing into a wall several times before someone opened an outside door and peered inside in order to see what the commotion was and if he needed to help handle the situation, only to be bowled over as the Night Aim slammed into him at a high rate of speed. Well shit, Orochimaru said as Senju Tobarama was rapidly dragged across the plains of the former rice country in a direction that led to Konoha. Chapter 9. Kakashi was several hours late, but he wasn't feeling up to giving his usual excuse this time. The only reason he was currently hopping around what had previously been the training ground that he'd set aside for his potential team, avoiding traps which had rather cleverly been set, had been to check and see if any of his students had been killed in the barrage of debris that had fallen upon Konoha before they could get to shelter. Aside from it being bad form to have a student die on you during the first day, before you could even reject them and send them back to the academy for retraining. He owed it to Obito to look after Sasuke, and owed it to Minato-sensei to look after Naruto. Losing one of them in a rockfall would just... He'd set out to search the training ground for his trio of future failures the instant the rocks and other debris, which had included a great deal of wildlife and a surprising number of fish, had stopped falling, and so far there had been no sign of any of his students, which was good news. There had been a moment when he'd spotted a flash of orange, and his heart had nearly stopped until he'd realized that it was a food wrapper, though. After dealing with the last of the gamut of ingeniously clever traps he'd been forced to avoid, he set out to make a more thorough search of the training grounds with an emphasis on places where his missing students might have taken shelter. As he was headed into the copse of trees that bordered the grounds he'd set aside for his test, he spotted a flash of orange in the corner of his eye. Whirling around, he found an out-of-breath Naruto rapidly approaching. "Sorry I'm late, sensei. Madara took me to the middle of nowhere to set my explosive tag, and when we were on our way back it suddenly started raining rocks and..." Naruto yelled once he arrived. It was probably the massive rocks that were scattered about everywhere, but all he could see and hear in front of him was Obito. Ma, it's fine," he said, waving everything off with an unconcern he didn't feel so. He didn't have to hear a boy 13 years dead speaking clearly to him once more. "Just help me find your teammates." In the den of a fox who was too freaked out to do anything other than sit and shiver, much less deal with the two intruders in his now exceedingly cramped living quarters. Sakura, who wasn't enjoying her close proximity to the object of her affections as she should have turned to Sasuke, who she could barely see in the dim light coming from the reasonably well-concealed den entrance. "You don't think Naruto?" she started. "No," Sasuke snapped. There was silence for a minute, and then, "It's just, do you remember how that substitute instructor reacted when Naruto started asking questions about that seal he showed the class, and how that old man reacted when he looked at that seal that Naruto made?" "Yes," Sasuke conceded. "But that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the dobe blew up a mountain." "He didn't." A voice that Sakura recognized as belonging to her new sensei said. "We're trying to find out what was destroyed, but based on the debris, it looks like it might have been an entire forest." Sakura was still shaking as she managed to squeeze her way out of the fox's den, which only desperation had sent her and Sasuke shooting into earlier. When she made it into the light of day, it was to see a team of ANBU patting Naruto down and removing various items from his pockets. There was another team of armed ANBU standing nearby, looking as if they were expecting trouble from the Uzumaki who had been dead last in every area of study since they had arrived at the academy. "But I didn't do it," Naruto exclaimed, as an ANBU in a tiger mask removed a hot glue gun from one of the pockets in the inner lining of Naruto's atrocious orange jacket, a rather bedraggled-looking thing that looked battered in every way it could be sped into what had once been a training ground and stopped at Naruto's feet. The instant it stopped, it began to form itself into something that looked very much like the Nidaime Hokage. "I hope the ride has stopped," the man said when he was fully formed. "Because I will kill someone if I'm dragged another inch." Being brought back from the dead was bad enough. "I didn't do that either," Naruto yelled. "You," the old man who had been following Naruto around for the last week exclaimed, sounding as if the man that looked like the Nidaime was the most hated being in the universe, and that he would gladly be rid of him in the most painful way imaginable. How the man could pack that much emotion into a single word, she didn't know. "Hey Madara, you got old," the man who looked like the Nidaime said upon spotting the old man. "And you're responsible for just about everything that went wrong in my life," the old man snapped. "As soon as I can find a way to blame the Uzumaki brat on you as well, I will." The discussion between the old man and the man who looked like Tobirama was interrupted by the Yanbu restraining Naruto, whose pockets were now empty. As the team of Yanbu wrapped Naruto in even more restraints than Iruka-sensei usually used. One of the Yanbu who'd just been standing around holding a weapon in case Naruto tried to do anything funny walked over to her new sensei and handed him a clipboard that he'd seemingly pulled out of nowhere. "Sign here," the Yanbu said, handing her new sensei a pen and an ink pad. Her new sensei scribbled something that bore a faint resemblance to Hatake. Kakashi, on the indicated line, stamped his thumb down on the ink pad and then on the paper, and then handed the clipboard back to the ANBU, who vanished with Naruto and his comrades an instant later. There was a startled swear as the old man vanished after the ANBU, and the man who looked like the Nidaime was dragged through the debris-strewn clearing backwards, cursing up a storm. "Well shit," Kakashi said an instant after the man disappeared, looking as if he'd just realized something. "What is it, sensei?" she asked. "I think I just accidentally passed you without even giving you the test first," her sensei replied as he looked down at his thumb, which was still smeared with ink. In IWA, an incredibly busy Oinoki who was one of several leaders of hidden villages across the continent who were sent scrambling by recent events quietly whimpered as the reports from Fire Country kept pouring in. Only that morning, he had commented on how it was looking like it would be a quiet day because there had been virtually no paperwork waiting for him when he'd arrived at his desk. And now, as he was listening to the news of the first forays to the edge of the destruction that had taken out several square miles of the fire country landscape and sent debris, raining down on dozens of towns and villages, even upon that nation's capital. On the radio, he received a missive from one of his spies in fire country, which had been marked as top priority merely because the agent had been assigned to a region near the destruction. As he read the short document, he went pale. "Give me any files you may have on Uzumaki Naruto immediately," he yelled at the harried secretary who was bringing in even more reports. Several minutes later, a set of files that had been marked as low priority, which had been tucked in with several files on other children who bore even a slight resemblance to Konoha's yellow flash, was on his desk. As he skimmed through the documents, which had been deemed to be beneath his notice by his underlings, he turned paler and paler. There had been rumors for years about how Konoha's Yondaime Hokage had been in a relationship with an Uzumaki, and nobody had thought to follow up on a blonde-haired, blue-eyed brat with the bone structure of an Uzumaki and a Uzumaki surname. The Yellow Flash, who had been known for his flashes of pure genius, which left the ninja world reeling, had bred with an Uzumaki who had been known for being either more insanely brilliant or brilliantly insane than normal, and he was only finding out about it now after the resulting offspring had caused an untold amount of chaos and destruction. The offspring, who was apparently rumored to have been associated with Uchiha Madara's alleged return from the dead, amongst other things. "You," he yelled to his secretary who was bringing in the initial damage estimates that were coming from Konoha, which was starting to look like it would be a sitting duck if it weren't for the Uzumaki who'd caused the problem in the first place. Put out an immediate flee-on-site order for one Uzumaki Naruto, age 12, blonde hair, blue eyes, height approximately 140 to 145 centimeters, and weight of approximately 35 to 40 kilograms. If anyone complains about a flee-on-site order for a newly minted genin who reputedly failed his academy graduation exam more than once, tell them that they can go and visit the crater that'll be named Lake Uzumaki as soon as the newly redirected river finishes filling it in. That night, as one Uzumaki Naruto sat in a cramped cell in Konoha's T&I department, trying to make room for his new guest who the interrogators had been forced to separate from Madara, who was currently in the next cell over, one Deidara Saturday table at an in several countries away whining. This whining had been going on for a good long time and didn't look like it would stop soon, despite the fact that the innkeeper had set the best of everything he had in front of the missing Nin in the hopes that he wouldn't decide that the establishment could better serve him by exploding. In the innkeeper's opinion, there had been far too much of that going around lately. "What's your problem?" A man who'd been sitting at the bar watching the brat piss and moan for hours snapped, finally drunk enough to have the courage to do so to the ranked missing Nin, who had been big news for all of a week until today's debacle. "The biggest art show," Deidara moaned. "The biggest art show the world has seen in ages, and not only do I miss it, but it was put on by a total fucking amateur." On Chapter 10. The entire graduating class for this year, what? Danzo yelled as he listened to the report his operative had given him. I don't think even half of the senseis had planned on passing them, but with the distraction, the 13-year-old root operative he'd sent out to scoop up any likely looking candidates who'd been failed because of failures on their teammates' parts, said, rather severely understating the chaos and devastation the Uzumaki had caused, completely by accident. "What about the distraction?" Danzo asked, wondering if that feeling creeping about in the corners of his mind was a newly developing Narutophobia, which was now being listed as an actual disorder. The first support group meeting was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Well, all of the Jounin senseis went to the Hokage and reported their teams as being alive without reporting any failures on the parts of said teams, the root operative replied. This was considered to be a pass, and all teams were registered as having done so, despite the fact that he'd thought he'd trained such blatant displays of emotion out of himself. Danzo buried his face in his unbandaged hand and groaned. The only good thing that could be said about today was that there had been rather few casualties. Considering two of Konoha's spies in IWA, who were posing as a married civilian couple, made their way back to their shared apartment with a hot-off-the-presses bingo book. Once indoors, they had activated their special privacy seals that would give outside observers the impression that they were talking about their days as they prepared dinner together and impatiently flipped the book open to see what had required today's revision. Something had sent the village's higher-ups scurrying, and the end result had been a brand new bingo book, which had been published 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Eventually, the two reached the added page and found themselves looking down at a sketch of Uzumaki Naruto who'd been labeled as being S-ranked, next to which there was the second Fleon-side order in shinobi history. Well, at least since the shinobi villages had been founded. Before then, Fleon-side orders had been a great deal more informal and had gone something along the lines of, if you get anywhere near that bloke in battle, run as if your ass was on fire, as a certain ninja or two was pointed out just before the fighting started. I wonder what prompted that, Kuno said as he noted the no bounty listed in the column that usually listed how much a particular shinobi's head was worth. That usually happened when a shinobi was considered too dangerous to even approach, much less kill for the money. The last no bounty had been the Yondaime Hokage, who had been deemed an impossible kill by several shinobi villages. The fact that the Yondaime had been taken down by the QB had furthered this reputation, seeing as it had taken the supposedly unsealable king of Biju itself to kill him, and he'd reputedly killed it in the process, a story which many shinobi outside of Konoha actually believed. I don't want to know, Kodachi replied to her spouse, musing. It's just a damn good thing he's on our side. Is he? Kuno asked, considering the fact that we've been treating him like shit for years. Kodachi swallowed as the implications hit. Was that sunny prank-pulling boy who'd been thrown out of shops and treated like an outsider by the entire village really on their side? What reason would he have to be so, if she'd been treated like that by the village? Why, you don't think he destroyed Konoha, do you? Kodachi asked. I honestly don't know, but I'm going to find out, Kuno replied, hoping to the gods above that that wasn't what had happened to earn the Uzumaki his S ranking in a Fleon-side order as a result of the treatment he'd received from the villagers since his birth. The ill treatment that he and Kodachi had participated in before they had been sent to IWA on a long-term spying mission. Tobarama sighed as he resigned himself to the fact that the Uzumaki boy whose side he'd been summoned to would be sleeping on his lap. He didn't quite know how he'd gotten there, but every time he tried to remove the boy with whom he was sharing a cell, the boy sleep-crawled back onto his lap. All attempts at waking the boy up had resulted in a sleepy 5 more minutes Madara before the boy was back in the arms of Morpheus. He honestly didn't know how to deal with this, because children had been more Hashirama's thing. Children, especially children who'd been born after the founding of the village and therefore not been forced to grow up quickly as he had, were strange creatures. He tended to prefer dealing with them after they grew up, and he could actually relate to them. His only consolation at the moment was that neither Hashirama nor Madara could see him now. They'd never let him hear the end of it, and for similar reasons. There were times when he could almost understand how his brother and the damned Uchiha had become friends. In a forest in the middle of nowhere, Zabuza, Haku, and the demon brothers Gozu and Mezu were gathered around a radio that was tuned to a pirate radio station that was run by Missing Nin for Missing Nin. Tonight's news program had been the most interesting in a good long while. Apparently, a newly graduated genin had blown up several square miles of forest and left behind a massive crater which was turning into a lake. IWA had issued a flee-on-site order for the boy as a result of said action that afternoon. Here with us in our studio is our local expert on the Uzumaki, Hugo Watari, formerly of Konoha. The news announcer said, Introducing that night's expert analyst. Considering the mixed bag that missing mean tended to be, ranging from political dissidents to outright nut jobs, the interview with the expert analyst on that night's biggest news story was generally very interesting. Someone who wasn't the announcer gave an unsettling giggle, and they called me mad. The man who was presumably Hugo Watari said, I told them. Uzumaki Naruto is the living avatar of Inari, and their treatment of him would only bring his divine wrath down upon the village. The rice crops came in smaller than usual, and the sake turned sour, and still they wouldn't listen. I tried to show him the proper respect, and they drove me from his side. I tried to return to his side, and they drove me from the village. One day, Konoha shall fall for their lack of respect, and I shall be there to dance amongst its ruins. The Hyuga's speech was punctuated by some rather disturbing maniacal laughter, which made Orochimaru look like a rank amateur in the art. Thank you for that informative. You may go now, the announcer said. And in other news, the bounty on Momochi Zabuza has risen by another 10,000 ryo, which the perpetually cash-strapped Kirigakure insists it's good for. I'm glad I'll never meet him, Zabuza said as he switched the news program off and moved towards his bedroll. Who? The Uzumaki or the crazy Hyuga? Gozu asked. Both, Zabuza replied as he flopped down on his bedroll while Haku poked at the fire. And Gozu and Mezu worked on repairing their weapons. Izumo and Kotetsu sighed as they made their way into the emergency shelters behind the Hokage monument. They'd been sent here several times over the last week, usually as part of the party of ninja who'd been sent to roust the crazies who'd taken shelter here due to Madara's return from the dead. They'd been sent alone this time, back to chase us out again. One of the older shelter squatters who looked to be about as old as the village asked. Actually, no, Izumo said as he pulled out the scroll he and Kotetsu had been given. I've been given a decree by the Hokage. This caused several heads to perk up, and soon the pair of career chunin were surrounded by a small crowd. Kotetsu opened the scroll which had been handed to him by Izumo and began to read. It has been decreed that due to the rebuilding process, ninja cannot be spared to clear out the emergency shelters. All current inhabitants of said shelters may remain in place for no more than 6 months, at which point they must vacate said shelters, unless an actual emergency has been declared. In the event of an actual emergency, all makeshift encampments must be cleared away in order to make room for Konoha's other citizens. Signed, Sarutobi Hiruzen, 3rd Hokage of Konoha, etc. Madara scowled as he sat alone in his cell, finding the silence unsettling after a week of constant noise. He couldn't possibly be missing that Uzumaki brat already. That Uzumaki brat who reminded him of a brain-dead Hashirama. That Uzumaki brat with that naggingly familiar face. That Uzumaki brat who it hit him with the force of a speeding dump truck. That Uzumaki brat who looked very much like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Uchiha Obito. Except for the chin and the lack of scarring, the resemblance really was uncanny. The eye shape, the general face shape, the annoying loudness. Great. He'd traded one highly annoying brat who would barely listen to him for another. Chapter 11. The man removed the ceiling panel leading to the attic crawlspace in the hastily constructed, newly built house. With expert aim, the man dropped the end of a thread into the open mouth of his snoring target below. As silently as the flapping of a butterfly's wings, the man uncapped a bottle of poison and sent several drops of it sliding down the string into his target's mouth. As the first drop of the deadliest poison in the world entered the mouth of the small blonde boy, a tidal wave went crashing through the attic and washed the man out the window where he was impaled on a comma. As the man struggled to breathe, he heard an ancient voice which reminded him of that of his elderly grandmother who had taught him his art say, seriously, the poison on the string trick? That one's so old that it was out of style in my grandfather's day. And you let him do it. A man who looked as if he'd stepped from the pages of a history book said as he moved into view, his face as impassive as the stone on which an image of it had been carved. "It's the boy's own fault for not waking up and preventing it," the elderly owner of the comma said. "Besides, he survived. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here." The last thing the man saw and heard was a small, sodden blonde figure squelching its way out of the house and saying, "Will you two stop fighting? I'm trying to sleep. And why does my mouth taste like oatmeal?" The Hokage smiled as he wrote out the order for a C rank, knowing exactly which team to give it to. While such inexperienced genin teams usually underwent at least one D rank mission before undertaking a C rank, getting them out of town would help ease tensions in the village, which was still cleaning up after the violently rapid creation of Lake Uzumaki. And, besides, thanks to all of the teams that had passed, there were more genin than D ranks this year. What better way for this team, which hadn't had a meeting since their disastrous first one, to get to know each other and form a cohesive team than out on the road while Naruto's new home in the woods was yet again being rebuilt? Sure, that old drunkard Tazuna was obviously trying to pull the wool over their eyes in regards to the expense of the mission, but what customer didn't? Knowing the usual mess, it was probably a top-tier C that he was trying to downgrade to a low-tier. Genin could take care of it without the help of a Jounin C. It wasn't like he would be stupid enough to misrepresent the mission entirely and try to get away with paying C rank rates for an B or A ranked mission, considering what happened to customers who did. 2 hours later, a small crowd turned up in the office. Team Kakashi reporting as ordered. Kakashi rather unnecessarily stated from his spot near the back of the group, directly behind a pair of decidedly shell-shocked genin who were trying to keep as far away from their third teammate and his companions as was possible while properly standing in formation. The third teammate, who had been released from TNI after it had been determined that he was in fact loyal to the village despite the fact that he'd nearly leveled it, seemed happy to be there in his office and happy to see him. Tobirama and Madara looked decidedly bored when they weren't glaring daggers at each other. That was. Naruto's release from the TNI department hadn't come too soon, since Tobirama and Madara, who was still capable of fighting despite his advanced age, had nearly leveled the department's headquarters during a spat over something or other involving said boy. In fact, the two men probably would have leveled the already badly damaged village if Naruto hadn't been ordered to order the two men to limit their swathe of destruction to a certain range and to keep their physical fighting outside of the village. It was clear, based on their animosity which had picked up from where it left off ages before, that outright forbidding them from fighting would have been far too much to ask of the two and likely would have caused the destruction of the village if they'd taken their ire at each other out on other people, places, or things. As you know, there is something of a shortage of D-ranked missions this year and, due to certain unfortunate circumstances, the Sandaime said, since your team needs a mission in order to be an actual team and learn the teamwork necessary to becoming a successful ninja, I have decided to give you a C-ranked mission instead. All right, Naruto hooped as his teammates looked terrified at the prospect of going on a mission with him, and Tobirama gave him a look. It's about time, Madara sniffed. Pity I have to be dragged along for something so menial though. Send Tazuna in, the Sandaime said, deciding to get the team out of the village before he came to second guess and regret his decision. What's with the three brats and the old fart? Tazuna asked. The Hokage was forced to leap into action in order to save Tazuna, since it seems that Madara had forgotten the age-old adage of, you don't kill the customer until after they've paid you, over the years since he'd died. After departing the battered village throughout which Naruto and his entourage were given a wide berth and wild cheering erupted as the team exited the village gates, the team set out on the road where the trip was almost completely uneventful until they reached a mud puddle that was resting on the road despite the fact that it had been several days since it had last rained. Kakashi had been about to set up a bit of a setup. To see who the ninja had been after when Tobirama gestured for silence, snuck up on the puddle and stood there and waited. A head cautiously emerged from the puddle and looked around. The owner of said head looked somewhat freaked out upon spotting Naruto and his traveling companion. "Get your own mud puddle," the foreign ninja exclaimed. "I'm snorkeling in this one." With that, the head popped back underwater. "Is that what they call it these days?" Tobirama said as he moved away from the puddle with a slightly disgusted look on his normally impassive face. "Calling what?" Sakura asked. "There's a set of twins in that puddle, and I for one am in favor of giving them some privacy," Tobirama said as he strode down the road and urged the rest of the group to follow. "You mean there?" Sakura said, going red from somewhere in the vicinity of her toes to the hairline of her Sakura blossom pink hair. "That's disgusting," she and Naruto exclaimed a second later. Gozu, one of the twins in the puddle, said once the group was down the road and well away from them. "Yeah, Meizu," Gozu asked. "Do you think we should warn Zabuza?" Meizu asked. "I think it's every man for himself in this situation. I'm sure Zabuza would understand," Gozu replied as the two leapt from the puddle and started running down the road in the opposite direction from the one in which the other group had gone in. The rest of the trip, aside from the mud puddle incident, remained uneventful until the group reached Wave, where Kakashi suspiciously watched as Tazuna and his compatriots displayed a great deal more caution than was warranted for a minor bandit problem. Suspicious, Kakashi ordered his team to remain on high alert. That order didn't stop Madara and Tobira from continuing their never-ending fight, though. Both men seemed to hold him in contempt and refused to follow through with any requests or suggestions he made. Both were apparently confident that they could handle whatever came up, and being Kage level, it was almost entirely possible they could. The constant bickering was annoying as hell, though, and the rest of the team, aside from Kakashi, who knew he had to remain on guard, were finding ways to tune it out. Sakura's Jinjutsu ability had gone from non-existent to highly proficient during the trip as she cast a Jinjutsu on herself that turned the squabbling into music from a memorized playlist. Sasuke had decided to skip the Jinjutsu and cover his ears with a set of highly expensive headphones which had been plugged into a portable radio. And Naruto, who didn't have the Jinjutsu ability of one or the money of the other, had used a set of improvised earplugs made of wadded-up tissue. Sensing someone who didn't belong, he decided to warn the group. After he called out a warning and dropped to the ground with their employer Tazuna, the children of the group watched as a sword sailed through the clearing just above their head height, taking off the heads of Tobirama and Madara, who had apparently chosen to ignore the danger they'd sensed in favor of rehashing old history that had previously been nearly 80 years dead and buried. The flying sword buried itself in the side of a tree, and as the rest of the group, who weren't preoccupied with reforming after taking damage, rose to their feet, a bare-chested man with bandages wrapped around the lower half of his face, who had tied his Kirigakure Hitayate at what was supposed to be a rakish angle, appeared on the handle of the sword that had gone sailing by mostly overhead. The man that Hatake Kakashi immediately identified as Momochi Zabuza, the demon of the mist, looked down at the group, his contemptuous glare vanishing the instant he took in the sight of Naruto and his two tagalongs who had reformed after their beheading. The enemy ninja swallowed, hopped off his sword, retrieving it on the way down to the ground, and sheathing it upon landing as he made his way towards the water. "If you'll excuse me," Zabuza said as he turned to run off to parts unknown. "I'm going to go explain to my employer exactly why you don't hire A-ranked ninja for S-ranked missions. Fucking cheapskate should have hired the Akatsuki if he wanted a bargain." "You can do that later," Tobirama said, moving into a fighting position. "There's the little matter of the fact that you took my head off that needs to be sorted out." Chapter 12. The fight between Senju Tobirama and Momochi Zabuza probably would have been the most one-sided fight in the history of fights during which Tobirama showed Zabuza what a true master of his element was capable of if a certain Uchiha Madara hadn't decided that he'd wanted his own back for his decapitation and butted in. For the first 3 seconds, the fight between the two water users was a thing of beauty as Zabuza summoned a bunch of water clones and moved them into position, and Tobirama lashed through the hand signs for a jutsu that had not been seen for generations. In the instant before, Zabuza would have been caught in the jutsu and sent whirling, disoriented and gasping for air only to breathe in water while his water clones were destroyed. A certain Kama-wielding individual jumped into the fight and knocked Zabuza out of the path of the jutsu. Not about to let Tobirama have all of the fun, Madara started beating the shit out of the Demon of the Mist. In the instant before Madara would have cut off Zabuza's arm and beaten him to death with it, a highly irritated Tobirama jumped into the fight and pulled the battered and partially broken Momochi Zabuza out of the path of Madara's attack. It was at this point that the fight against Momochi Zabuza, who was no longer capable of putting up much resistance, turned into a fight over Momochi Zabuza. Despite the fact that Madara was so old that his wrinkles had wrinkles, and the fact that the fires of his youth were banked taking the high of battle with them, Madara could fight exceedingly well when his dander was up, and nobody could get Madara's dander up the way Tobirama could. With no fear of injury or death, there was no reason for Madara to hold anything back. It was for these reasons that Madara was a near-even match for Tobirama, who had been nearing late middle age at the time he'd died. For Madara, this was quite the come-down, as he had previously been an almost perfectly even match for Tobirama's much more talented brother Hashirama back when both men had been in their prime. As the Nidaime Hokage and the co-founder of Konoha battled, Kakashi decided that discretion was the better part of valor, picked Tizuna up, signaled to his students that it was time to run for it, and ran. He could see all 3 students trailing after him out of the corner of his uncovered eye. It was as Naruto ran that a problem became immediately apparent. As Naruto followed, the fight between Tobirama and Madara, which hadn't paused even once since it started despite the fact that it was being dragged, followed with him. Before he could make the decision to order Naruto to remain behind for the safety of his client and the people of Wave Country in general, Naruto seemed to have spotted this problem on his own and stopped. Kakashi signaled his thanks to the boy and signaled that he should find cover until the fight died down. He seriously regretted leaving his student behind, but it was the only thing he could do in the situation. Relief spread across the faces of Tizuna and the 2 genin that trailed after Kakashi. After they had gotten some distance away from the battle zone, Kakashi didn't quite have the heart to disillusion them by pointing out that nowhere on the island was safe, due to the high power of the massively destructive jutsu that the 2 Kage-level ninja were using, and the fact that the fight was moving due to the fact that Naruto was being forced to move in order to dodge. Instead, he focused on making his way to Tizuna's house, where he and his team sans Naruto would find temporary respite from the current insanity that could potentially go on for ages, considering the fact that the 2 combatants weren't limited by such mortal concerns as exhaustion, injuries, or death. With everyone busy either fighting, running away from the fight, or ducking away from the fight while resolutely staying in the area so nowhere else gets destroyed, nobody noticed when a young ninja in a mask came in and dragged the wounded and now forgotten Momochi Zabuza away. Gato watched the explosions in the distance from the safety of his treetop office with a sense of accomplishment. Just about everything that could go wrong with this mess of an island that pretentiously called itself Wave Country had gone wrong. First, the overly proud natives hadn't gone down as easily as they should have. Then, some hero had shown in their midst, while the execution of said hero had stopped all overt signs of rebellion. The natives tended to be rather passive-aggressive towards him and his men. Then, that Tazuna bastard had started building a bridge to the mainland which would cut into his shipping profits. Shipping profits that had gone way down here. Because none of the highly impoverished wastes of oxygen who were living on a piece of real estate that was worth far more than the inhabitants' lives could afford to have. Anything shipped in. Now, it was starting to look like his luck in this place was going to change. He tried to sabotage the bridge project several times only for each attempt to mysteriously fail and the one responsible for the counter-sabotage to remain steadfastly hidden despite all attempts to unmask him. With sabotage out of the question, he had decided to resort to such crass methods as direct intimidation and outright daylight destruction to cow the bridge builder and his work crew. The damned bridge builder had responded to this intimidation by going to the impoverished daimyo for funds and leaving to fetch ninjas. He'd responded to this final insult by hiring ninjas that nobody in Wave could have afforded in a million years. Ninjas who happened to be exceedingly disposable. Missing nin who could be killed rather than paid and turned over their home village for their bounties. When 2 of the 4 ninja had vanished, he'd thought that there would be a problem. But the explosions near one of the more popular smugglers' landings showed that the remaining ninja were going all out to earn the pay they would never live to receive. As a massive wave of water crashed into a giant firestorm, the last 2 individuals he expected to see at that moment flew into the treehouse office through the next window over, the badly injured larger one being carried by the smaller one. "If you're here," Gato said, stunned. "Then what the hell is that?" Momochi Zabuza's loyal servant Haku glanced over his shoulder at the gigantic cloud of heated steam that was rapidly spreading over the island, shrugged, and said too, "Of Uzumaki Naruto's teammates having an argument. Who the hell is Uzumaki Naruto?" Tsunami peered out into the near-impenetrable mist which reduced visibility to almost zero, worriedly watching for her father, who was due home about now. For the most part, she knew that her vigil was futile and that she would not see her father, who had likely died in the explosions that were still booming in the distance today or at any time in the future. But there was that small niggling hope that kept her standing in the doorway waiting to welcome her father home despite the explosions in the distance and the strange and sudden hot mist that had swept across everything, hiding the world from view. As she watched, her thin thread of hope slowly dissolving into despair, a dark shape that didn't move like her father or anyone else she knew appeared and swiftly approached the house. After backing away from the door, slamming it, and locking it, she turned to find Inari so she could grab him and run. If a stranger was approaching her home, it didn't mean anything good. Hopefully the locked door would provide a distraction that would buy her and her son a few seconds. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could hear the rattling of a doorknob that had once only rarely needed locking, usually to keep nosy little children who might interrupt outside. As she climbed the stairs approaching her son's bedroom, the pounding on the door started. As she reached her son's bedroom, the pounding got more intense. "Come on, Tsunami," a voice that sounded just like her father's yelled drunkenly. "With all of the shit I've gone through today, this is the last thing I need. Open the door." Tsunami wavered. Then she remembered all of the stories about how ninjas could turn themselves into your loved ones in order to trick you, and how people were killed or tricked into doing things by strangers who were wearing the faces and voices of people they were closest to. Becoming even more resolute in her decision to run, she snatched her son, who was crying over the picture of his stepfather, off of his bed, completely ignored his protests as she dragged him out of the room and down the stairs, and snatched a knife off of the kitchen table. Thus armed and laden with the most precious thing left in her life, she opened the back door, raced outside, and dragged her son to the woods, ignoring the stranger who stood on her doorstep, pounding on her door and yelling in her father's voice as she fled. Tomorrow, she would smuggle herself and her son off of the island and make her way to the continent. Tonight, however, she would hide and mourn the loss of her father whom she and Inari would return to avenge one day. The rare wave country mangrove trees were nothing but kindling. The salt water swamp in which they grew was actually on fire. The earth of the coastal wetlands was glassed. There was a massive crater where there had been forest. A massive crater that had started filling up with salt water. Flaming salt water. Neither combatant seemed to notice this. Madara was finally on the ground, and Tobirama was impaling him on a hastily constructed earth spear in order to pin him. There. I win, Tobirama said. Now where the hell is that asshole who took off my head? I think he died, Naruto said as he crawled out of his hiding spot at the edge of the massive field of destruction. This is all your fault, Tobirama said to Uchiha Madara, who had broken off most of the shaft of the spear and was in the process of pulling himself off of the remaining section that was buried in his body. No, Madara yelled as he stood up and took a fighting stance. It's yours,